Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. My name is Madeleine Kemna. I'm a volunteer at the Library of Mistakes, and in my day job, I'm the economist for Dutch investment fund Hoofdbos. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight Rachel O'Dwyer. Rachel is a lecturer in digital cultures at the Dublin College of Art and Design, and she is the author of Tokens, which was longlisted for Financial Times Business Book of the Year. And tokens are a bit Marmite. People either love them or hate them, but they seem to be coming more and more. Money is turned into tokens, whether we like it or not. In fact, in the not too distant future, I would not be surprised if we ask you to make a donation to the Library of Mistakes, that we list a whole range of tokens in which you can do so. So, whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. I hope Rachel will tell us.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. And thank you so much for having me and for the invite this evening, and thank you to Golden Hair Books as well for participating. I just wanted to say it's such an amazing space that you have here. It's really just, it's so incredible, and it's so cozy as well. So when we were talking about the format for the event tonight, Madeleine asked me to maybe just give a little presentation before we kicked over into a Q&A. Can everyone hear me okay? Is my mic okay here? Yeah. Yeah? It's okay? No? Yes. So am I speaking loud enough? Yes. You sure? Okay. Okay. I just wanted to go through, I suppose, a few kind of aspects of the book. So Tokens, this book is sort of the product of 10 years of research in, what we now call, I guess, the fintech space. And I guess some of the questions that I'm sort of interested in asking about this area were, if sort of state-backed money is being replaced by tokens that are issued by platforms, who controls the shapes that they take? Madeleine was asking me before the talk, how did I get interested in this space? Because I think a lot of people in the audience maybe are from a traditional sort of maybe economics or banking or finance background. And I'm feeling a little bit on the back foot because I'm not, because I'm actually from a fine art background, and then I did a PhD in engineering, and I was very, very interested in like the social and political implications of technologies. And I was doing a PhD actually in the political economy of radio spectrum, of radio waves, and like who owned radio waves and how they were kind of owned and marketed. And one day I came across M-Pesa, which is, it's the biggest mobile payment system probably in the world, and somebody was explaining it to me, and they were saying, right, so in Kenya where people are experiencing, and in Zimbabwe where people are experiencing hyperinflation, they're using, phone credit basically as a de facto currency. So they're using it as a way to easily send money to one another. And, instead of taking a phone credit top-up code and using it to top up their phone and talk to their friends, they're texting this code to one another as a form of money. And it just completely blew my mind, because I was like, okay, so you're telling me phone credit is money, and this is money that's being issued by a mobile network operator. So suddenly a mobile network operator is sort of acting like something that looks a little bit like a bank, and phone credit or airtime is something that looks an awful lot like money. And so for me, that was the moment that I got really, really interested in I guess, what I call like money-ish or money-like things. And that was kind of the beginning of tokens. So I wanted to talk about just a few aspects of that. But, what exactly like do I mean, like by tokens? Obviously, we have, there's a lot of discussion about this in, what we call the crypto spaces, like tokens that represent some kind of utility in a system, tokens that represent shares, and then, maybe tokens that are like script, some kind of form of payments. Now, people have lots of different sorts of ways of, I think, defining tokens, but this is sort of how, how I tend to define it, which is, if we think of fiat money as being, having these sorts of definitions, like the classic economic definitions of money as being, a unit of account, a store of value, a means of exchange, and obviously, like, legal tender. For me, like, tokens are all of these things as well, I guess. The sort of things I think that are maybe different are that, they're not legal tender. You can't use them to pay your taxes. And they tend to kind of have some kind of like limited fungibility. Like, they tend to come with strings attached, some kind of special conditions about like who can spend them or where or when or, for what. So like an Amazon gift card, for example, is a token. Because it only gives you access to Amazon services and goods on the Amazon platform. And as it happens, Amazon pays its Mechanical Turk workers outside of the US and outside of India more recently, exclusively in Amazon gift balances. So, these are kinds of money-ish things, but they're money-ish things with strings attached. So tokens are, they're ostensibly new. Like, we've heard so much about them. I might move my mic over this side because I'm going to be turning my head to my notes occasionally. So, like, we're hearing a lot about tokens as being ostensibly something that's very new, But they've played such a huge role in, like, antiquity and circulated alongside sovereign money, So they're used for kind of grey markets, used for, I suppose, like kind of extra legal things like sex work, used to gain access to spaces, used to finance wars, and used for things like prestige and like bragging rights even, which I find really fascinating because we hear about that now with like NFTs. But Claire Rowan, who's a historian of tokens in antiquity, has looked at how various tokens at like moments hundreds of years ago also had these sorts of special like prestige values where the value in the token had nothing to do with its exchange value. It was about like the symbology and understanding basically the in-joke around that token. But they're used to do things like pay for jury duty and make judicial processes more transparent. Everything basically that tokens are used for today. But gradually, I guess a lot of those tokens maybe sort of fell out of fashion and were replaced more and more by legal tender. And one of the things I was wondering about when writing tokens was, is money in terms of like state-backed or publicly mandated money, is that maybe just a blip? Like, is money a blip between these sorts of rich token economies? Because we're seeing, particularly in the last 15 years or so, that we're seeing sort of a proliferation of different kinds of tokens. And I'm not exclusively talking about like the NFTs that drove headlines in 2021, although, that's part of it. I'm talking about things like airtime. I'm talking about like loyalty point cards. I'm talking about air miles and game tokens and Fitbit units and, like virtual ice creams on TikTok, and everything in between. And these tokens are, they do a lot of different things. So they're a way for platforms to capture new sorts of streams of value and everything from like customer data to loyalty to trust. They're a way for platforms to sort of get around the regulatory issues of being an employer, being a payments processor without officially kind of being either. And they're also kind of a way of tying like payment to specific conditions, like, as we've seen with so many examples this year, identity, for example, but also to various different kinds of like, morals or to values. And I just want to talk kind of about a couple of aspects of that. So the first one I wanted to talk about was, tokens as sort of a value transfer layer. So we're hearing a lot about like tokens and tokenization now, but obviously tokens have been this kind of ownership claim for, a very, very long time. And that's sort of associated with this particular like monetary theory. I feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but this monetary theory called metalism, for anyone maybe who isn't familiar with that, the idea that money is valuable because it represents some kind of ownership claim to something that's valuable, like gold bullion. I just was really fascinated, when you're thinking about something like tokens today, that like some of the earliest examples of money are something like Mesopotamian tokens, where they're money, but they're also, they're records, and there were records of kind of stored grain that was kept in these shared warehouses. And the token is a record of actually the grain that was, that was held in the warehouse, and that in time then kind of circulated, obviously, in lieu of the good. So the good is, it's heavy, it's lumpy, and it's awkward to kind of circulate that. So the token stands in, for the good, and becomes a token that represents a sort of a claim to that thing. So it sort of allows this sort of heavy, lumpy thing to kind of stay in one place. I mean, something like rye stones as well, obviously, have come up so much, I think, with blockchain and things today. Again, there's sometimes, like, I suppose they're called, I'm putting it in inverted commas, like primitive money. But, there's actually, there's nothing kind of primitive sort of about this. They're sort of part of like a Melanesian kind of economics, where these very, very large stones that are manufactured off the islands act as money. Because the stones are so heavy, it's impossible for them to act as a bearer instrument and move from hand to hand. So instead, the stones stay in the same place, and, ownership sort of changes hands by kind of you basically update an oral ledger. So, the stone that belonged to Madeline now belongs to Rachel, and now the stone that belongs to Rachel belongs to David, and so on. And like a story I came across actually when I was researching the book was about this stone that fell overboard when they were bringing it back to the island one day. So it fell overboard in a storm, but instead of striking the stone from the ledger, they decided, well, we know it still exists, even though like we can't see it anymore, even though it's at the bottom of the ocean. So we'll still transact as though, the stone exists. And people kind of talk about that as being like, this is such a crazy like transmutation of value, but it's no different from something like fiat currency, and it's a sort of an example, I guess, of how in our token economy, the kind of underlying kind of physical value of the goods in some ways isn't really what matters. What actually matters is our faith in the token. Milton Keynes, as far as I know, wrote a paper in the 1990s about rye and about the Yapese economy, where he made that argument, where he was like, don't call this an exceptional economy. If you think this is weird, take a look at fiat currency, And that is really what I felt as well, like when I was looking at NFTs or looking at like tokenized art, where I'm like, people are like, oh, these Bored Apes, they're worthless, they're so stupid, like why? But, in some ways, like all of anything that we sort of place collective trust in is always kind of a question of what do we believe is valuable, and we can kind of make that argument almost about anything. So there's been a real push to sort of tokenize art, like physical art as well, in a similar way. I'm actually going to jump over a bit of this because I feel like it's probably getting a little bit long, I think. So yeah, like tokenized physical art, and kind of in a maybe a repetition of the kind of Mesopotamian like grain tokens, even tokenized like soy and tokenized grain on the blockchain more recently. So Argentinian crops that have been tokenized on the blockchain. Then obviously, we heard a lot about tokenized NFTs in recent years. I think I kind of sort of made the point there a minute ago when we were talking about the rye tokens, where, something that was kind of, I think, very like disturbing to people was how these tokens had no sort of underlying value in a lot of cases. this is a work by an Irish artist, unfortunately, Kevin Abosh, who was a very well-known, I suppose, NFT artist called the Forever Rose. And the work actually has no material instantiation. So there was no, this is quite an early work, like it's from 2017. So he was one of the first NFT artists. And when I was writing about it, he was really, his team kind of made sure that I wasn't misrepresenting it, because the work has no instantiation. Like it's just a smart contract. The image there is just for kind of illustration purposes. There actually is no image. There isn't even an image of a rose. So it is just a smart contract. The work has no image, it doesn't even kind of have a digital version, if you know what I mean. So it doesn't exist in a physical sense, he said. It is the result of using blockchain technology to create a virtual proxy of a photographic work. So there's nothing kind of to this except for the token, and that's sort of what the work was about. And I think people find that idea really, really sort of vexing, but in some ways it's only kind of really revealing the fact that so many of our like financial instruments are purely just like tokens. So I mentioned like I have a background in fine art, and I worked in a museum of modern art even, during college and things like that, where we had a couple of really weird situations where, like we had one situation where somebody stole a cigarette, like a Marlboro cigarette from an exhibition, and like caused a complete like meltdown in the exhibition where they had to close it down, and it was just a regular Marlboro cigarette, But there was a piece similar to that where Dan Flavin, he's a conceptual artist in the 1980s who made works out of fluorescent light bulbs. And there was a recent kind of inquiry where an owner had lost their token or their certificate of ownership of their Dan Flavin. They wanted to know if they still owned a Flavin, and the answer was no. So even though they still have the material underlying good, because they didn't have the token anymore, basically the work was worthless. So I don't know, I kind of got really, really sort of, I guess, really interested in sort of maybe the relationship between these sorts of tokens in these economies and the underlying kind of value layers, and came to the conclusion, I suppose, that like obviously while NFTs were worthless, and while there were claims that maybe they were like disrupting the market in some ways, in some ways they were almost perfecting the market in a really awful way, I guess, but that they were, that they were sort of taking that market in some ways to its like radical conclusion. The second thing, and probably the thing I find most interesting about tokens, I suppose, is the kind of exploitative aspect of them, or the way that they functioned as a sort of regulatory sleight of hand for platforms. So they're often a way of kind of shoring up like grey markets. So at some point you've probably all like exchanged a token for, a beer in a student union bar or something like that. Some space maybe where there wasn't like an alcohol license. So you gave money, were given a token, handed over the token, were given, alcohol or something like that, where because this isn't money, you didn't actually, the exchange kind of didn't take place. It's kind of like a wink, And these are, I'm not going to pronounce them right, I guess. I'm not sure. I've actually never said it out loud. I just realized. I don't know. So I don't actually know how to pronounce them. Spinitriae, I guess, they're like Roman. Does anybody know how to pronounce them? Yeah. Yeah. And can you tell me, so is this something you're Are you interested in these? Yeah, sorry. Maybe that sounds like a really... Yeah, okay, sorry. So they are, and I mean, so these are tokens from ancient Rome, and I mean, I'm going to maybe slightly generalize because they may or may not have been used. They're not really sure what they were used for. They may have been used for games, they may even have been used for gambling. I guess the kind of hearsay is they may have been used to pay for sex work. But they're not actually sure. It's just one theory, is that they might have been used to pay for sexual services, because it was illegal to use a coin with the emperor's likeness on it, I think, to pay for this. And also it was illegal for slaves to handle money. So they think potentially maybe that these tokens were sort of a way to get around those issues. So they were sort of a regulatory sleight of hand, a way of paying without appearing to pay. And I think that's also, why platforms often issue tokens. So I mentioned at the very start of the talk that Amazon pay, Mechanical Turk workers, for example, in gift cards. So Amazon, they're effectively a bank, even though they don't have a financial license. So they do a lot of money-like things in the background without actually being officially a bank. And they also do a lot of employee kind of things without officially being seen to employ. And so I was very interested in Amazon's work with Twitch, for example. So alongside kind of Mechanical Turk, Amazon operate a streaming service called Twitch. I'm just going to jump ahead actually to they own Twitch TV. So this is a screen grab from Twitch TV. Twitch is like a streaming platform for people who like to watch other people play video games, which is basically my childhood because I have 5 brothers. So it's like people playing video games, but there's kind of a lot of other niche content. So this is ASMR, which you may have heard of. I think I'm always going to forget what autosensory meridian response, I think. So it's like different, again, it's kind of stuff that, speaking of things that are kind of on the edges, it sort of flirts, I guess, with adult content, but it isn't quite adult content. So it's kind of like sound, like she will, for a certain number of tokens, she'll like lick the microphone, for example. And it's like unclear, what is going on there. So there's a whole range of like just chatting kind of streams on Twitch, which are hot tub streamers. And again, they are sort of pushing at the limits of what's acceptable content on Twitch, which is not an adult site. So Twitch is doesn't allow adult content, like you're not allowed to eat bananas in a sexy way. But you can wear sort of bikinis in certain contexts. I'm just going to jump ahead if I have an image of one. Yeah, if you're in like a paddling pool, because that's kind of an appropriate place to be in a bikini. So you have hot tub streamers who will, who kind of they are actually sort of gaming the system too, if you know what I mean. They're kind of pushing it like what is acceptable content and how can I sort of game the rules of this. But Twitch was initially it was called Justin TV. And streamers, they were just setting up their own channels and sharing content, but it was quite informal, and they would sort of link to their PayPal account, they would link to their Reddits, and people would just informally like tip them, and there wasn't sort of an intermediary, taking a cut of that. It was just kind of informally, like, if you like my content, you can send me a gift or you can send me money. When Amazon then acquired Twitch in 2014, they sort of changed that model. So they inserted themselves as a kind of intermediary in that tipping system and started to take a cut of that. So now streamers monetize their content in a variety of ways. So they have, you can subscribe to streamers you like. Streamers have like advertisements and affiliated links on their streams. They have links to wish lists where you can buy them gifts, again on Amazon. And they have these things called Twitch bits as well, which I'm going to just jump ahead to, which are like tokens, basically, that you can buy and use you can give or cheer in the vernacular of the platform to streamers that you like. So the bits cost, 100 bits cost $1.40, and when a streamer cashes them out, they're worth $1. So Amazon takes 40 cents to every dollar. And they're customized emotes, so they have specific valences. They mean different things as well on the channel. So they're not just money, or cheers. They're also a kind of communication. They have different kinds of valences and meanings, basically. And they're gamified in particular ways. So Amaranth, who's, a very well-known hot tub streamer, for example, has various different kinds of games there. You can see that different amounts of bits, will spin a wheel, for example, or will get your name on her body, or, the business of money is kind of gamified in particular ways. This is a virtual streamer called Cold Miko, where actually your bits, your money, your tokens will modify actually her physical appearance. So you can see like butt size, breast size, weight, those sorts of can actually be modified with the money. So it's kind of money that can reach out, or exchange media that's reaching out and actually transforming the avatar or the body of the streamer. So it's, tokens they're less than money in some ways because we're kind of restricting what people can do. But these tokens are also kind of more than money in a lot of ways, because people are using them to communicate. They're using them to kind of control the body of the streamer. They're using them to say things like keep going or stop. So yeah, I mentioned that for Amazon then, the token is sort of a way for them to sort of take a cut, obviously, of that. So when the token's cashed out, they're taking 40 cents. Sorry, this is Pinky Doll. On TikTok in the summer, there was sort of a breakout moment as well, where various streamers on TikTok as well were being paid a lot of money in virtual gifts. And, as I was saying a second ago, I guess the reason why fans like these gifts, obviously the reason why Amazon likes the gifts or TikTok likes the gifts is because it allows them to sort of take money, and it allows them to sort of be an employer without officially being seen to employ, because this isn't real money. So if it isn't real money, I'm not a real employer. And if it isn't real money, I'm not a real payments processor. The reason I think why fans like it is because if it isn't real money, this is kind of more like a gift, and I'm kind of more bonded to you, and I have a sort of a parasocial connection with you in a way that just giving you money and transacting with you, I think, doesn't. And that's sort of my feeling anyway about that. So, tokens have this sort of more social element that money doesn't have. And the last one, which I'm much quicker on, so I'll finish really soon, is that tokens are, they're programmable. They come with these sort of strings attached. So when in theory money is supposed to be like liquid or fungible, like a dollar is a dollar, tokens, are designed to kind of limit fungibility in particular ways. And so I was talking to Helen, the librarian, I can't see her here, oh yeah, she's over in the corner. Just before the talk, we were sort of talking about these tokens. I was telling her about butter vouchers in Ireland. In the 1980s and 1990s, they were like a social welfare token that, supplemented people's like dole. So if people were out of work, they were given these butter vouchers, and ostensibly they were exchangeable for butter. But if you tell anybody over a certain age, or ask them about a butter voucher, they'll tell you everything you could buy with the butter voucher that wasn't butter. So people in Dublin call them backy vouchers. So tobacco, buckfast, like beer, like it's really interesting. And they'll tell you the kind of inventory, the shops that took them, like Knowles, what a man Noel was, and Maureen's took them, and so-and-so would take them for beans and egg, and like, it's really, really fascinating. And Helen was just telling me about like that there was sort of a milk voucher similarly in Scotland, where like with friends, they would kind of barter them or like circulate them, or it's just really fascinating how people had sort of ways of sort of getting around these. And Viviana Zellitzer, I also promised Helen I'd mention this book. She's an economic anthropologist who did really fascinating work on like charitable agencies in the 19th and 20th centuries, where she looked at how these agencies, who are ostensibly about like helping the poor, they kind of, they felt that cash was like a dangerous form of relief. So they were looking at, how do you turn cash, which just gives too much freedom to the poor, into something with strings attached, basically. Something that's not just value, but has the right kinds of values. And so, they were all about turning cash into these kinds of tokens that only gave you access to like the right kind of food or the right kinds of goods. And yet people like the Dubliners with their butter vouchers tended to find sort of ways around those terms and conditions, They would set up different kinds of arrangements. I guess what we're seeing increasingly today, though, is those conditions are kind of being hard-coded maybe into the tokens, so that it's increasingly difficult to get around, like SNAP benefits in the US, for example, which is a food stamp. Those conditions are programmed now onto an electronic benefits card, where you physically can't buy hygiene products with your food stamp benefits. You can't buy hot meals. You can only buy cold meals. So, you know, it's programming not just value into the token, it's programming, you know, specific values, and whose values are they, you know? And obviously, recently we've seen some really kinds of extreme versions of these, or quite dystopian versions of these, like WorldCoin, obviously, where we're seeing, you know, sort of potentially some kind of like relief for universal basic income tokens being tied very closely to identity, various different sort of discussions percolating around CBDCs or digital cash, and how those in the future might be tied to things like not only digital identity, but various different kind of forms of access to the means of payment or to transactivity. I actually had an article about that today. And maybe I will just leave it there, actually, because those were just the three I kind of wanted to look at. I guess I have examples, and they're in my book, actually, of better, other examples of how maybe communities have used, tokens to sort of shore up care, or, do other kinds of more cooperative things. I thought this was really interesting. In the summer, different communities were sort of looking at like Venmoing kind of their communities to kind of as a form of reparation. But those are sort of three areas anyway. That's like a really quick overview of different aspects of tokens. And thank you again so much for the invite to such an amazing space. Yeah, thank you. You have the typo, the copy with like something like 700 typos.
Thank you very much, Rachel. To be honest,
you,
I didn't notice them. I was fascinated by the many examples you gave that showed us that tokens are nothing new. Indeed, they started already in 7500 before Christ. And there are many different forms, but I guess the common denominator is that where there are tokens, as you say somewhere in the book, there is control, there are restrictions, there is exclusion, and that is actually quite scary since, like we said at the beginning, it seems that we are on a way where tokens cannot be stopped. We will have tokens whether we like it or not. So since we're in the library of mistakes, what lessons can we learn from these mistakes that have been made with tokens in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I was in Edinburgh a couple of years ago. I think it was probably the last time I was here for something academic, and it was like a talk about methodologies for engaging with fintech. And one of my methods that I wanted to put forward was like failure. So like, what can we learn from looking at failure, and specifically looking at failure in the fintech space? Because I feel like an issue I encountered a lot as a researcher in fintech is that when you try and speak to an up-and-coming company, there's so much like bombastic hype when that it can be really, really hard to kind of figure out like what is truth in these sorts of spaces. Like, can you imagine trying to talk to like Sam Bankman-Fried like 2 years ago? What would have been what would you've been told, versus speaking to people after something has failed, or looking at the sort of space after something has failed. And I was thinking even like, for me, a really key, like I've been trying to figure out like what is the sort of balance of power between the state and the platform, for example, in terms of the issuance of tokens. And for me, Libra, for example, and the sort of failure of Libra, like Facebook's sort of failed experiment, one of Facebook's failed experiments. Facebook has failed to launch digital money multiple times, actually. So they keep failing to do it. But maybe that most recent like big failure really, tells us a lot about the balance of power between the state and the platform. So, very briefly, I suppose that I'm having that pandemic time warp, but 2019, 2018. Yeah, no, it's like literally it's pandemic summer, I think it's summer 2019. Yeah, summer 2019, I think they first announced, you know, Libra, and it really looked, I think, for a moment to a lot of people like Facebook were going to, you know, issue basically their own money, and that they were going to create, you know, a super app that would look quite similar to, you know, the kind of Alipay or the WeChat Pay kind of model in China, where you have this sort of app that is kind of social media and payments and a system of underwriting credit all rolled into one. And for me, what was actually more even worrying than the sort of linking maybe of like, you know, their previous kind of legacy of working with like transactional or working with customer data and, you know, what that might mean, was the sort of KYC or the know your customer aspect, which is, you know, I think there's a quote in there somewhere where I spoke to a consultant called David Birch, who people might be familiar with. He works a lot on payments and digital identity, and he said, yeah, I call it known by Zuck. And he said, you know, like I can buy a fake passport on the internet, but try and build a fake Facebook profile. Now that takes like huge grunt work. You know, it's so hard to do. And it did seem like Facebook would be able to produce digital identity better than anyone else. And in some ways I wondered, are they even interested in digital money? Are they interested in global digital identity? And the money bit is just like a passport, you know, to doing that, to issuing some kind of global digital identity. That's a really maybe a long segue, but, you know, it looked like, you know, people sort of talk about this idea of like technological inevitability, and it definitely seemed like, yeah, this might be inevitable. But then there was such a strong kind of pushback from, you know, so many governments, where there was a really definitive, like, keep big tech out of finance kind of response, and kind of strong regulatory response. You know, so I thought that was quite interesting in terms of like, you know, definitively saying where the balance of power still lay in terms of, you know, who gets to be a bank or who gets to issue currency. But yeah.
With that, I'd like to open it up for questions. I think we'll start at the back and work our way forward. I think there's a roving mic here somewhere.
Thank you, Rachel. Great talk. In your work, have you found any relationship between a rise in trust in tokens inversely to the lack of trust in fiat money? And also, I guess, just to your point around the Facebook money, is it maybe too big to be trusted, and maybe it will always be informal, a bit like your butter, sort of vouchers? Will it always just be local, maybe more sort of like cigarettes in prison versus a big alternative currency? So sorry, two questions there.
Yeah. So, sorry, so you're asking,
is there an inverse proportion? Is there an inverse relationship between the trust in fiat money with the trust in tokens, I guess? Like in your early Zimbabwe example,
yeah,
the use of digital, airtime with the lack of trust in the Zimbabwe currency.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Like for me, I think I hope I'm going to answer this, because I think for me, like obviously a huge, you know, I'm not going to say anything maybe anybody here doesn't already know, but like a huge driver for the first kind of emergence of things like Bitcoin, because the technology, you know, sort of already in place. Like you can see, I was really interested in looking at like the history of the cypherpunk and the extropian like mailing lists. And those technologies are sort of already in play well before the financial crash. And yet there's something really seductive suddenly about those ideas about disintermediating the banks. And that's, as you say, it's because people's trust in fiat and in the banking system is at an all-time low at that moment in time. And then I really wanted to know, like, why are people then suddenly so interested in crypto again in like 2020, and what trust is kind of shaken there? And I feel like, I don't know if it's about fiat, I feel like it's like our trust in like the good life, or our trust in like the future.
Was institutions?
Yeah, or politics, like, or any kind of incremental politics. But like, yeah, I don't know, I was thinking about, like, I was watching this show on Netflix called Beef, where there's two of the main characters are these Korean brothers living in the States, and like their parents sort of followed that like American dream model where, you worked hard to like build something. So they ran a motel, and it's that kind of rise and grind. Like maybe you go to college, you work hard, you build equity, you buy a house, you retire, and that's sort of a good life model. Or you go to college, you buy a house, you get married, and these are the stories we tell ourselves about how life is supposed to add up to something. And yet, like, for so many like millennials or Gen Z people, those stories aren't really materializing anymore. And the pandemic, I think, was a real moment where a lot of people were like, I don't trust these stories anymore. So why not like gamble on an NFT and hopefully win a house or win some kind of future? Yeah, that's, for me, that I felt like there was definitely a connection between those two things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. Could you talk about the differences between the .coms and tokens, and the similarities, the differences? Because .coms were so big for a while and tons of money and big companies, and then they just kind of went away. I mean, they just kind of busted.
Yeah.
Do you see that happening with tokens, especially, the big boys now that seem to be kind of falling off? Do you see that also happening, or similarities, differences?
I feel like I don't understand or know enough about the .com bubble to be able to...
They were kind of the emperor has no clothes as well.
Yeah, well, no, and I've heard people make that... people have been making, I suppose, that kind of analogy recently, where they're like, this is just like the .com bubble, where, things aren't over. This is just like you're sweeping out all the hype, and now this is going to like clear out the cobwebs and allow the stuff that has real utility to like come to the fore. But I almost, in hearing that, it's made me realize, gosh, I actually don't know anything about the .com bubble or how that even worked. Maybe because I was, like teenager, or I just never really studied it. No, but I just didn't. I haven't really. I don't know. I don't fully understand.
Just need an extra day in this library.
Yeah, but like, yeah, I think I'm definitely. No, I actually had that thought recently, where it's like I don't know anything about that, and it's kind of embarrassing because I should. Yeah.
To me, it sounds very simple.
Yeah.
The emperor has no clothes. I mean, it's kind of like,
yeah.
there's nothing there. I
Yeah.
mean, that's my analogy of this and the tokens, but I just don't know if maybe there's more beef to the tokens and sticking around, or I don't see it, but...
Yeah, I saw a really interesting writer, Edward Ngueso, who was actually writing about drawing analogies between like the role of venture capital in Silicon Valley and crypto. So I can't answer, but his work might be a good place to look, because
What we can say, and Rachel explains this very clearly in her book, is that this is much more serious than the .coms, because the .coms had no platforms that were able to determine people's lives. At least in most cases they didn't. And in this case, these tokens, the way they're programmed, and Rachel calls this persistent programming, so there is no wriggle room, and they determine how they're going to be used, who gets to use them. And that's much more invasive than the .coms, I would say.
So maybe it does have a little more beef to it than this .com floating out.
Well, it's certainly going to have more impact, yes.
Thank you. Perhaps I should stand. Thank you. Thank you for the talk very much. I have to say up front that I'm someone who doesn't like Marmite. However,
That's grand.
I don't want to be antagonistic. In fact, I agree with you in many of the examples that you give. I'm also, unfortunately, an economic historian, but I do agree. You're right. Tokens seem to arise when there is a restriction, like an employer giving tokens to restrict their employees to what they will buy and what shop they will buy it. You're very correct in saying that sometimes when the currency breaks down, people will turn to other things like cigarettes. And you are also very correct in pointing out the issues that arise from the monopoly of violence that the state has. And if the state decides that I'm going to deal with the central bank and that's who I'm dealing with, my main question is, what's different now? How can tokens now be the future of money, as you put in your title? So I actually don't disagree with your list, but what is different from the Industrial Revolution tokens or from the cigarettes in post-war Eastern Europe or eggs in Zimbabwe during hyperinflation or anything like that? So what actually makes tokens now, well, how are they going to be, or even whether they can be the future of money? That's more of an extrapolation question that I'm asking.
Yeah, I guess because probably two things I guess that I think are interesting. One is like I felt, and maybe I shouldn't even admit this, I felt I couldn't believe how little control you have over things like your subtitle and your cover when I wrote a book. So, because actually, for me, I felt like it was a book that was about kind of the history very much of money. But yeah, so I did not choose my my subtitle. But no, I do feel like, that said, I do think that, where previously maybe that there was a sense that there was sort of one kind of money-like thing, and that there, that there was maybe like a sort of always a sort of a murmur or a kind of proliferation of other sorts of things, that sort of murmur is kind of almost overwhelming other kinds of things, and that increasingly there are individuals or groups or transactional communities almost where people are transacting or are being paid in particular tokens, and that those are, if economists will think about money in terms of having or not having money, that there's a whole other layer of stratification in terms of the kinds of money that we have. So somebody who's engaging in sex work on the internet, for example, and if I want to patronize her, I can maybe buy those tokens with a credit card. But if she wants to be paid, there's a whole kind of lengthy process when it comes to sort of cashing the kind of tokens that she's paid out into real money. But I do kind of get what you mean. Maybe do you mean that at the same time, at the end of the day, you have to kind of cash all those tokens out into real money? Because I do sort of think at the same time, all of these tokens are kind of riding the rail of real money. And at some point, it all comes out, yeah.
But even more importantly, what you mentioned about the state can change the rules, and then move they go. So and it's always been like that. With all these tokens.
Yeah.
So I don't disagree with you. Just wondering what might be different.
And then I guess for me, the thing that's maybe different about these tokens, and these are tokens that are issued by the state, though not just by the platform, is that where there was wiggle room, like the butter voucher, there's often no wiggle room now. And that's, really worrying. There's that really lovely description in The Handmaid's Tale of her going to buy cigarettes and not being able to, because that's a state token, but, overnight the system's been shut down and she's not able to use her credit card. And Atwood is asked, I think in an interview in 2017 about, why does she write these sorts of speculative fictions? And she says, well, my fiction's a way of showing you where the road is going. And, if you don't like where the road's going, you need to change the script. And And I sort of feel like sometimes, you know, we need to reflect on some of these tokens in that way. Like, is this where we want, you know, our money to go? And if not, then maybe, we need to really, really seriously sort of think about, like, yeah, the future of these sorts of programmable tokens issued by the state or the platform.
Sorry. Can you also comment maybe very briefly in this light on the quote you have from Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI, who says that as he would, AI will actually do such a lot of the work that we will all be jobless and a universal basic income will be necessary, for which we will need a digital identity, which will necessitate a token. Is that something that you envisage in this context?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, that feels like a swap. It's like almost like he's kind of finding that's a sort of a justification for why WorldCoin. I don't know. Does anyone else have any thoughts on WorldCoin?
See view all of this. If Amazon are paying tokens, how does that token then how do they actually value that token and actually tell how much they've earned in a year?
How does who see that?
Well, if you have to pay tax, right, to do tax, who's valuing these tokens?
Okay, I actually was on a Reddit forum recently where somebody was looking at, she wanted to apply for not a mortgage, maybe a loan, but she needed to show how much she was earning in tokens, through her work. But yeah, they have a cash out balance, like they have a exchange value. And so...
And there's whole debates around cycles of assets and when something's trading, when it's not.
Excuse me, Sarah, could you please use the microphone?
Oh, sorry.
If you want to talk, you got to stick your hand up, otherwise no one can hear us on the...
Sorry.
In answer to the gentleman's question, I'm a tax guy, declare an interest, and sadly have followed the last 15 years of people doing this stuff.
Yeah.
And becoming incredibly rich in things that you wouldn't imagine. I work in tax disputes, so some of the sub-economies that you've been describing have been my clients. But when it comes to the rule sets, these are being published and a lot of them don't make sense. A lot of the laws that we work around about where the value is depend on citus. Depending on where you think something is situated. There's a whole debate in the tax industry about virtual currencies, about coin, and about whether you tax it on whether you're in Dublin, or whether you tax it or whether you're born in Dublin and live in London, or whether it tax it because your company's in Isle of Man. But I'll pass the mic at that point.
Yeah, no, this was a sex worker on Chatterbait, and she was looking at basically tips, these tokens, and saying, I need to show sort of the history of my donations, and it was literally because she was applying for a bank loan or a mortgage, maybe even, I can't remember, but needed to show the history of her income. And it was fascinating.
Thank you for that contribution. We had a question over there.
Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah, I do have a question. When you mentioned CBDCs, right? And obviously it's becoming more programmable, so which means it's in a sense more token-like. And given that it's issued by the system, the state, the issuer that issues fiat currencies as well. I'm just kind of interested about what you think about that, and whether or not maybe if it's a good thing or a bad thing that the actual proper currency that we're using is becoming more programmable, more token-like, and it could be quite a drastic change. If you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be particularly in favour, I guess, of CBDCs myself. And I don't have my notes actually in front of me. So, but there's various, I suppose, different iterations of them. And again, I'm sure people can chime in and be but you have, various different versions where there are versions where the individual like you or I could potentially almost hold an account with the central bank, where they are kind of issuing it directly to you, or another sort of a version where they are issuing it to a sort of a commercial bank who then issues it in turn to you, and that sort of commercial bank kind of acts then as an intermediary in between you. And I guess, those two versions, look quite different in terms of the kinds of levels of control maybe that are built into the token. And then there's all sorts of questions about what kinds of control are written into the tokens at issuance or at other layers. Again, I am really, really fascinated to know what people in the audience think about this, what kind of conversations are happening maybe around the digital pound. I've sat in on a few kind of policy discussions around the digital euro recently that were really eye-opening and a bit frightening. Yeah?
Sorry, we had a question over there.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe changing the topic slightly, but you talk a lot about permissioned digital assets. And when I say permissioned, sorry, here.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
When I say permissioned, I mean they're distributed by a single entity, a centralized entity, and that entity has control over how they're spent, how they're used. They can program, they could inflate the currency as a form of taxing its holders. But you don't talk about permissionless digital assets. And someone had a question earlier, actually I think it was yourself, and you were asking why now? Why have the conditions become conducive towards these types of assets, these digitized currencies? Well, really, up until about 15, 20, 30 years ago, the technology didn't exist. Cryptography is a relatively recent field. Before the 1970s, it was exclusively used by the military. Before the 1990s, it was only very scarcely used in finance. And now technology is ubiquitous. Encryption is ubiquitous. We use it for everyday communication. We practically use it everywhere. That's maybe an answer to your question, that creating a non-fungible asset with provable scarcity was impossible before the past 20 years. Do you talk about this in your book, or do you exclusively talk about tokenized assets that are
permissioned?
Permissioned, like CSGO skins, or...
sorry, no.
Yeah.
No, I guess within...
I say this because about 86% of all crypto assets are permissionless, which means if someone sent me, $1 million worth of Ethereum and it landed in my wallet, I could send it to whoever I wanted. I could send it to a terrorist. I could send it to my drug dealer. I could send it to... I could buy a Ferrari with it, and nobody could stop me from sending it to another wallet. Now, someone could look at it and say they're not going to accept it.
Well, except I guess there's a whole sort of range then of also though like permission smart contracts being built out where it's like you can buy this if these particular emissions tests or whatever are satisfied, or these particular conditions are being satisfied. I suppose whether those conditions are off-chain or on-chain, though, is maybe another sort of element of that. But I would see those as being kind of folded into, like, programmable tokens in some ways. Yeah.
Maybe we've got another one here. You want to talk to Rachel afterwards?
I'm going to change tack and just ask you, do you think that our freedom requires us to require our governments to legislate to preserve physical money as a human right?
Sorry?
To preserve physical money as a human right.
I'm so sorry, I just missed the first bit of your question.
Do you think our freedoms require our governments to legislate to make the continuing permanent existence of physical money a human right?
I absolutely do. I
Good.
absolutely do. Yeah. Yeah, no, I really do. I mean, I was on like I mentioned that with the CBDC thing, that I was on a kind of a call recently where they were really framing the digital euro as being, you know, somehow you were bringing, like, it's that whole banking the unbanked thing again, you know, so they're bringing the, I think, did you want the mic again? They're bringing the unbanked into the digital fold. And I was thinking of, like, I have an elderly neighbour, Joan, who I help shop, and she is pure cash. There's no way she would go near a digital euro because she doesn't even have a mobile phone, you know, she won't have any job.
I mean, you're describing my 92-year-old mother who doesn't have an email address, doesn't have a mobile phone, never has text, has no digital footprint whatsoever.
Absolutely, and that, but like, I feel like that should be kind of there should be a basic kind of right to opt out.
I guess, as a subsidiary, I guess maybe we come from different directions. You seem to think about it just empowers people that are maybe not digitally literate. I'm thinking about, you know, as soon as we only have digital currency, then the government can force us to spend our money by imposing a negative 10% interest rate, for instance, in the next recession.
Like demurrage kind of thing, or
And our last question, I believe, over here.
Hi. So I'm going to do something dangerous, which is thinking at the same time as speaking here, just to make sure I've... just in terms of this idea of platform-based tokenization, the way I've understood what you've been describing is that by holding on to these tokens, the platforms ultimately can double-end a transaction. So in order to be able to give a token of some kind to an individual providing some sort of service, you have to pay money in fiat currency and you get a certain amount of money. So let's say you put, like, I don't know, £100 worth in. Really what you're getting in terms of the token value is probably about 90, let's say. Because
when you say you, is the person who's buying the token?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that token that you can then exchange is actually worth less in fiat.
Yes.
Right. And then ultimately when the person who
cashes it out
gets even less.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you wanted to kind of give them the equivalent of, like, the amount of a packet of cigarettes, ultimately they couldn't buy that packet of cigarettes at the end of it.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So that's a bit of a worrying thing. I mean, as somebody who's not very well versed in economics, that is concerning, because ultimately that transaction focus, that transaction is devaluing what you actually have, because you ultimately have to use it for goods. But the same problem occurs, or a similar problem occurs, if you are holding all of your goods in fiat currency, let's say, and I've got money in my bank account, and then all it takes is a few stupid words from a prime minister, and all of a sudden the value of your money and the things that you can buy with that money have just gone down, right? So my question to you is, do you have any ideas from what you've learned in your research for a way, and I guess this is the goal, right, for preserving the value of what you have, your wealth? And I know that that's a naive question, and I'm not an economist, so I'm going to ask it.
No, I don't. I really don't. But no, I just think what you've said is so fascinating. It's really interesting. No, but I don't have an answer at all.
I'm afraid it's preserving and growing it in line with inflation. That's the thing.
Yeah. Beating inflation, ultimately.
Huh?
We've got to beat inflation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's the whole purpose of saving.
Yeah.
Well, even interest rates are save, but not going to beat inflation, right?
But, you know, you're kind of reminding me of something I heard where, as well, somebody was talking about platforms doing kind of mad things with the sort of float as well, of when they were sort of holding money, even like PayPal. I can't even remember what it was, but actually, you know, when you were like acting as sort of a clearance, that they could potentially maybe be doing things with money that they were holding temporarily, or like speculating with that. But I don't know whether that it just kind of made me sort of think of that as well. But I hadn't really thought of that. I think a lot about what happens when it's cashed out. But I hadn't thought of that, also that moment of when you're kind of putting it in. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Thanks, Madeleine.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Golden Hair Books, who will be selling Rachel's book, and Rachel will be signing the book if you want. And we thank Canox Asset Management, our drink sponsor. Thank you.
Thanks a million.
Oh, great stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for that.
Thank you.